It is Tuesday, and it's time for the Daily Bread drive-through. I want you to know that I've been up since, I guess, about 6 a.m. this morning. I tend to get up around that time. That's the goal, at least, for these Daily Bread drive-throughs. But I want you to know that when it's time to go live, I'm getting dressed like I'm going to work. It is not just rollover or pajama pants down low. I've even got sneakers on. My right laces are not laced, though. I'm going to keep it real with you. But I'm ready, and I share that because I hope that you are counting down the time, even if you're back to your job and you're working from home or whatever, that you're preparing your heart in the same way. This is not just about information. It's about revelation from God's word, and it's about heart preparation. So if we want Bible saturation, we've got to come here with the heart preparation. It says in First Kings that when Solomon was building the temple, it says the stones were cut off site, meaning when the stones came for the building of the temple, they came on site already prepared. Peter says that we are living stones of we make up the true temple of God. We want to come prepared, already cut. That was just a little intro. But look, today we're talking about race in America. I want to talk about Charles Darwin. I want to talk about John Locke. I want to talk about David Hume or David Home. His name was changed or mischanged in how it was spelled at some point. I want to talk about Otabenga. In the Bronx Zoo, we had a pygmy. America had a pygmy on display in the Bronx Zoo just 100 years ago. I want to talk about the preacher who petitioned the mayor of New York, Robert Stewart MacArthur. He was the spokesperson for the black churches at the time in New York City. He was a Baptist pastor, and he wrote to the mayor, who at the time was George B. McClellan Jr. He wrote to the mayor for the release of Otabenga, again, who was this African pygmy from the Congo region, 4'11", who was in a cage on display where people went to see him, and he was in the section with the monkeys. Now, let's just look at Robert Stewart MacArthur. Let's look at this Baptist pastor who petitioned the New York City mayor at the time for the release of Otabenga. Would that have been considered social justice? That was social justice. And that's the kind of biblical social justice that we are about at Antioch, because we believe that's what the scriptures admonishes and exhorts us to do in loving our neighbor as ourselves and being that good Samaritan. But we're going to even get into talking about social justice, because that's a loaded term, and the church is now becoming divided over this thing called social justice. Would you, back then, have written the mayor for the petitioning of the release of a man being kept in the section with the monkeys in the zoo? Just being kept in the zoo, period. That is social justice. That is the biblical social justice we want to walk in. But again, we are going to get into that. There's so much we're going to be talking about with Season 3 of Daily Bread Drive-Thru, looking at race in America. I'd like to begin by reading a quote from Stephen Jay Gould. He was a Harvard professor, lived from 1941 to 2002. Actually, when I was pre-med at the University of Pennsylvania, I used his textbooks. I even used his textbooks in high school, taking advanced placement biology. He said this: biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. He said biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. Well, what happened in 1859? In 1859, Charles Darwin wrote his book, The Origin of Species, which of course just launched all throughout the world. The worldview of evolution is that man emerged basically from order and chaos. We evolved, from the Big Bang all the way through evolution, all the way up to mankind, and that man was the highest evolved life form. The evolutionary theory is an explanation of life without God, saying that life basically is an accident by chance. It's random chance that has just all of the complexity of life came out of just a cosmic accident. And basically in 1859, that started and went forth with the origin of species. It's interesting that even Darwin doubted his own theory, but it's similar to someone playing with matches and saying, I didn't mean to burn the whole house down. He was playing with matches. It's an age-old lie. But I even want to read how he even had doubts about the theory of evolution. He said, to suppose that the eye, talking about the eye, to suppose that the eyeball, with all of its inimitable contrivances, adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, that this could have been formed by natural selection, it seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree. He says that in The Origin of Species, found in, I guess, the most common publication, found on page 217. But that view was taken, but you need to understand that, going back to Stephen Jay Gould's quote, he said biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of the evolutionary theory. You see, what Gould is hitting on is even before Darwin, you had Enlightenment philosophers in Europe, even if you go back to even Aristotle, that racism and seeing certain classes and races of people as superior to others was already being pushed, was already the philosophy that was justifying, subjugating, conquest, pillaging, even raping and killing specifically Africans and the indigenous. If you go back even to John Locke, these are some people you just need to research, because what we're looking at here is evolutionary theory and how it pushes forth and encapsulates the idea of racism. We're, of course, in season 3 looking at race in America, but we're just taking really a giant step back to take this panoramic view of racism, where racism comes from, really where race in America has its germ and its seed, the seedbed of what we now see as race in America. I mean, doesn't that make sense? If we're going to look at race in America, and before we get into critical race theory, and before we get into intersectionality, and all the while preaching that the gospel is the answer and the only answer to racism, John 3:16, Romans 3:23, Galatians 3:28, Colossians 3:11, all being one in Christ, the ground being level at the cross, the Bible making clear that all man is made in God's image and likeness. But again, because we're living in these complex times, and Proverbs 4:7 says, with all you're getting, get understanding, and 1 Corinthians 12:32 highlights the tribe of Issachar, that they understood the times and they knew what they needed to do. It, I feel, behooves us to take a step back. And while we can put hours into Netflix and hours into the smartphone and hours into new apps, no, we're going to take the time, step back, and really get a panoramic foundational view of race in America, racist ideology in America, where the seedbed is, and realizing how without gospel revival and without gospel change, that of course there would still be the same ideologies to today. Of course there would still be systemic racism to this day. So just by looking at the ideologies before we get up to the present in 2020, we can see that this momentum is still continuing to this day, and it needs to be challenged. The challenge comes from the Word of God, but it helps to, of course, understand the times that we're in. How we doing, Annie? We're doing good. Okay, my daughter always holding me down recording. So, before you had, well, let me just back up here. This origin of all racism is sin, right? Wherever there is sin, there will be self, right? Wherever there is self, there will be self-exaltation. Wherever there is self-exaltation, it is always at the expense of putting someone or something else down. So we know that the foundation of all racism is sin, right? That being said, and before we dive into the word, I just want to just finish this little timeline of how when Darwin came in with the origin of species, that is what Hitler was inspired by when he then said that the Aryan race was the most evolved race and that there were others that were not further along in the evolutionary process and were then seen as subhuman. He described and sold the ideology that the Jewish people were subhuman. That's why they could be treated like animals or worse than animals. So the origin of species came along, and it is an ideology that pushes forth racism. You cannot hold to the evolutionary theory without holding to the one lie comes with the other lie. The lie of the evolutionary theory that man is the highest evolved life form. The buck stops with man. Man is man's own Lord and Savior. The law of the claw, king of the mountain, whoever climbs to the top. You cannot have the lie of the evolutionary theory without having the lie of racism. And we live in a world that mocks you if you don't believe in the evolutionary theory. So it just gives you an idea of the world system that we're in, and how racism, seeing others as lesser than, as less evolved than, as subhuman, subjugating, the law of the claw, all of that, it goes hand in hand, the evolutionary theory and racism. So you need to even examine the next time you think it's intellectual to ascribe to evolution, you're ascribing to the very ideology and worldview that was used to justify subjugating, killing, pillaging, and seeing others as less evolved. Even if you look at the Australian Aborigines, how they were even claimed to be the missing link between the human and the ape. The New York Tribune in February 1924, they were considered the missing links between ape-like ancestors and the rest of mankind. And then you read of the atrocities committed against the Aborigines, and just the unspeakable things done to them. Well, the evolutionary theory gives people this ideology. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. You need to look at, well, let me just read this quote by Aristotle. This is from a book called Black Athena. In Politics, one of Aristotle's writings, even he said this back then. So it just shows you that even before Darwin and the origin of species and the evolutionary theory, you still had sin, right? And wherever there's sin, there's self. Wherever there's self, there's selfishness. Wherever there's selfishness, there's self-exaltation. And it's always at the expense of putting someone down. The Greeks felt that they were a better race, a better group of people than all other people groups. Look at what Aristotle says. He says, the races that live in the cold regions and those of Europe are full of courage and passion, but they're somewhat lacking in skill and brain power. For this reason, while remaining generally independent, they lack political cohesion and the ability to rule others. So he's describing as the European groups that were above Greece as having courage and passion, but lacking skill and brain power and unable to rule others. Then he describes, he says, on the other hand, the Asiatic races have brains and skill, but they lack courage and willpower, so they've remained both enslaved and subject. He says the Hellenic race, or the Greeks, occupy a mid-position geographically and have a measure of both. He's saying we have the courage and the passion and the brain power. He says, hence it's continued to be free. That he says that's why we're not enslaved to anyone. We have the best political institutions, and we are capable of ruling others given a single constitution. He says that's why I justify us even subjugating others, because we are better than them. So we see that even before Darwin's Origin of Species, there was still this self-exalting. John Locke, he was born in 1632. He lived to 1704. John Locke was an English philosopher and physician. He was regarded as one of the most influential Enlightenment thinkers. He had the belief that Africans and natives did not practice agriculture, which is a dead-on lie. Native life here in America before Columbus had, not only did the natives, I don't know if you knew that natives actually invented the game lacrosse. A true surveying of the native lands was not like Disney will portray, with just people just running barefoot and hiding behind trees, and carrying arrowheads. But there were civilizations, there was trade, there was irrigation systems. They invented the game lacrosse. They were able to do a technology of creating brush fires and creating parks and recreation centers, all of this before European colonizers came over. But John Locke had sold this view that the Africans did not have any agriculture and that the natives did not have agriculture. And while he was a big proponent of life, liberty, and owning property, therefore he sold the view that it was not property. He was in the 17th century, and what we need to see is that, it says in Proverbs, right? It says in Proverbs 18:21 that life and death is in the power of the tongue. Just look at how a lie can go forth, and just look at what it does. Look at the power of philosophy and how it frames people's thinking. Interestingly, today as Christians, we need to watch. Look at how a philosopher like John Locke, and he was then followed by David Hume, and then they came up with the ideology known as Empiricism, that all knowledge is obtained from what you see and observe. Again, that's evolutionary thinking. Never mind revelation from God that says we're all made in God's image and likeness. Never mind revelation from God that says we are all of one blood and that there's only one race, the human race. They would birth empiricism, saying we are the highest evolved life form, basically. What we see and observe is what matters, and that is law. So John Locke, David Hume, major philosophers in what would justify racism and in what would justify oppression and subjugation and the pillaging and whatever. Where I'm going with that is this. If we see the power of philosophy during the Enlightenment period and how racism was even hatched, we need to take a look today at the philosophies that are beginning to circulate about the church. The caricatures that are beginning to circulate about the church. And if the power of one man, if the power of two men, if the power of three men could bring forth ideologies that can cause people to see natives and Africans as subhuman, completely against truth, well, then we need to be watching today, the church, for how easy the philosophy can emerge and already is emerging in us being seen as mentally not there, as a worldview that is deemed dangerous, when in fact we have the worldview that has the only definition of true love, the only teachings that speak of a love that even says to love your enemy, and obviously the correct revelation of us being created in God's image and likeness. We need to also be watchful and be praying with ideologies today. So, there's some verses I'd like to write down. Please write down Malachi chapter 2, verse 10. Has not one God created us all? There is only one race, and that is the human race, right? But then, of course, you'd say, well, then where did the races and the different people groups of today come from? We're going to get into that. Wow, we said 20 minutes, didn't we? Yeah, you know what? We got to keep it a bean. Listen, come in tomorrow. We're going to look at the biblical breakdown. There is a scientific answer for where the races came from, and it is based on following the scriptures. Tomorrow we're going to look at Genesis 1, us being made in God's image and likeness. We're going to look at the fall in Genesis 3. We're going to look at the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, and we're going to look at the Tower of Babel when God confounded the languages of man because they were rebelling against him. He gave different languages and sent confusion among the populace, among mankind, because man was trying to unite in rebellion against God under one Nimrod, right? Which is a type of the coming world ruler, a type of the Antichrist. But we're going to look at melanin, we're going to look at genetics, and we're going to look at where do different skin colors come from? Where do different eye shapes come from? And how is this spelled out in Scripture? Because we know the Bible is not only historically reliable, but is also scientifically accurate. So I'm tempted to go on, but we said we were going to keep it lean and mean in 20 minutes. So look, let's come in tomorrow. I would recommend that you look up this article. And look, you know that there's so much, people's thinking gets so affected that just knowing that there were particular African people groups kept in a zoo. And by the way, what they were commanded to do while in captivity was throw spears, race animals, do tribal dances. People would come. These zoos, it wasn't just the Bronx Zoo. The world fairs in France, world fairs in Europe, in England, people would come in millions. Whites would come in millions to see these displays. They would even kidnap Eskimos from Alaska and bring Alaska indigenous over to these world fairs to be kept in captivity and to have them all march before whites. But you know, that affects people's thinking to where, based on even our education system today, how many would just think that, you know, basically that's all was going on in Africa, and that basically Europe was going through Europe was civilized, you know, and Africa, you know, was just all indigenous life with bush people, quote unquote. I'd like you to read a couple of things just as you prepare for tomorrow. One, please read, and let me dig up this article before I get out of your way. And pray for me. I got a lot of notes. I got a lot to unpack. Please type this in. Black People on Display, The Forgotten History of Human Zoos. It's from Rife Magazine, April 30th, 2019. Black People on Display, The Forgotten History of Human Zoos. You want to look at that. And then you want to also look, please research Mansa Musa. Is anyone aware that while Europe was still in the Middle Ages, one of the greatest kingdoms ever was the Kingdom of Mali, where Mansa or King Musa had so much gold that when he went on a caravan to Mecca, he brought so much gold to Cairo, Egypt, that he gave out generously as gifts that he bankrupted Cairo. He flooded the market with gold just with his generosity. You need to read about Mansa Musa. And the article I would even recommend there would be, let's find this in the notes. It's going to come up in the notes somewhere. Mansa Musa, The Kingdom of Mali, and the Splendor of Medieval Africa. The Kingdom of Mali and the Splendor of Medieval Africa. You want to read that article. And then you want to read Mansa Musa, Great Leader of the Malinke Kingdom. We need to just be informed. And, you know, it's sad as we're going to go just more into race in America. And praise God, the gospel is the answer. But is it any wonder why, if you go to YouTube and look at the famous doll test, you know, as they had black children sit in front of a white doll and a black doll, 15 out of 20 of the black kids said that the white chose to play with the white doll. Look it up on YouTube. And when asked which doll was the good doll, 15 out of 20 picked the white doll, and which one was the bad doll, and they reached for the black doll. You see, not being taught Mansa Musa, Otabenga being kept in a zoo, John Locke and David Hume, the seeds of racism. Yes, this is still here in America. All you got to do is open a textbook. But look, I've already gone too long. I'll see you tomorrow. I got to go. God bless you.